Hi crafters, it's Kathy from Scrap and Bean, and today I thought I would try to help take some of the mystery out of embossing. So just some basic embossing. So the first thing I did was pull out my own bin here of a variety of embossing powders. I often get asked which powder you use for what, or what's the difference. So it can be kind of confusing. Here's one called an embossing enamel. There's embossing glaze. There's sticky embossing powder. How's that different? This one just says the color and that it's opaque. This one says it's detailed. Okay, that's a good one. We'll hold that aside because at least they tell you what it is. This one's mixed media embossing powder. This one just says it's a baked texture. It's still a powder. You still heat it and emboss it, but a little bit different. Embossing powder, holographic. Embossing enamel. So you get the idea. There's a real variety here. This one tells you again, it's detailed. This one just says it's a mix. This one says it's tinsel. More embossing enamel. I love those. You can tell I do collect some of those. Mixed media powder. Embossing powder. So sometimes they give you some hints, sometimes they don't. And then here's one, ultra thick embossing powder. So how do you know what to use? So I'm going to put these into two different categories. One is detailed embossing powder and the other one isn't detailed embossing powder. So that is really putting them into two very general groups, but we use those two groups in two very different ways. And I'll do some examples of how you would use each one. Because for me, it's easier to remember the differences of any kind of a product if you get to visually see how they react differently. So I've pulled out these two that say that they're in detailed embossing powder, and it's very helpful when a brand puts that right on the bottle that it's detailed, because then you know. And what that means is that the powder is a very, very fine powder versus the other type is you can get quite chunky with the powders. So of course, if you're using a powder that's chunkier, when it melts, when you heat it, it's going to spread over a larger area, even if that's a microscopic area. But if it's a piece of powder that's super tiny, in other words, detailed, it's not going to cover as much area, so that you'll have a finer detail showing up on your finished project. So if you were doing something like embossing a sentiment, which is a word, which is generally quite fine stamp, then you definitely want to look for something that says detailed on it. Or at least visually look in the jar and compare that it's something very, very fine compared to something that is very chunky. So let's take the lid off a couple of these and zoom in. So hopefully we can see the difference here. So this one, right on the jar, it's telling us it's a fine detail. Now if I have something here, some tweezers, if I dig some of that out, and you can see it falling. It's just super fine powder, really nice and small. That's our detailed. This one here in comparison is very chunky. Where's my camera? You might even be able to see if that focuses. That the silver is very fine. This one's very chunky, and apparently it's not going to focus. Sorry, I'm going to give you all headaches there. So get a focus for us. So here is a close-up of these two jars. And I think you can see on the camera pretty quickly that this one is a much finer powder than this lighter one here. Also, you can see that this one has a mixture of different colors, which makes it very interesting when you're using it. So you can tell, even if the jar doesn't tell you if it's fine or not. Let me move this so I don't mix it up. but you can see that this is a very fine powder versus this other one that is a mixture of powders, but you can see in there is some large chunks. And also, because this is what I would call a mixed media powder, it just means it's got different powders mixed together. So there may be some fine ones in there. There's some glittery ones in there. There's some brown, there's some white, there's a little bit of blue, which makes it really fun. But it's definitely different than this one here. So let's do some embossing with both of those, since they make quite a difference. And just see, so that you can see what the difference of those two are. So to demonstrate these two different types of powders, either one that's detailed or one that is not detailed, I'm going to stamp up both of these sentiments I have got ready with a clear Versamark stamp pad. So this is a pigment ink, which just means it's going to dry very slowly unless you heat set it. But the benefit of it staying moist longer is that your powder can stick to it until you have a chance to heat set it. So I'll just put both of those stamps on there with that same Versamark ink and just let that ink go onto the paper good. So you won't be able to see it there because it's clear, but once I put the powder on, then you will be able to see where it's at. So I need a piece of scrap paper here. Put my piece on there, and I'm going to first do this detailed. So this is our detailed silver. Take off the excess, and you can see where the powder has gone on there, nice and fine. You can read it already. Then I'm going to put this excess back in my jar so I don't have a big blooper here. And I'll even put the lid back on. And then I'm going to go ahead, before I even heat that, I'm going to go ahead and put on this chunkier embossing powder on the second sentiment. Few little strays there. Just take that off, and now you can see it's a lighter color, so it's not showing up on camera quite as well, but you can see some of the blue shows, some of the twinkle shows, and that's actually not coming out too bad there for a chunky one. But maybe I can point out on here, the larger chunks didn't actually stick to the powder. Just this one has a mixture. It's got some fine and some chunkier embossing powders in there, and the chunkier ones just fell right back off the card. So there's not enough of an area there to even hold it on. Just the finer ones stuck on there. So we'll see how that works out for embossing when we're embossing a fine detail, a detailed stamp, I mean. So I wonder if we can take a close look at that. Okay, so my choices in colors are a little different. The silver one shows up quite well, and you can read it. So, you know, each letter is staying separate. So the if here, the I and the F don't meld, like they didn't melt together. Even after this word mess, and you have the little period there, that little period shows up, because it's a very fine detailed powder. So all the little intricacies, the little lines on each letter show up really well. This one, it doesn't help that I used a light color on a white background. You can actually see, you know, like I can read it. Maybe on camera it's not so well, but I can read what it is. But here's the challenge with this is only the finer detailed powders in here stuck to it. So if you used a powder that only had chunkier, there's a chunky one, and it's in a dark color. So let's do this again. And it'll show up better in a dark color to show you the difference. So I'll use this long stamp. Still going to use Versamark again. And just let that ink go onto the paper nicely. And I'll turn my scrap paper over so I'm not mixing my powders. And this one's beautiful and chunky. And you can see, even down here, you can probably see how big the chunks are. Yeah, they're very large. Get off a couple of strays there. Now this side, it didn't even stick on there at all, so I'm going to try and just press some into there and help it out a bit. And it doesn't want to very well. Okay, so I'm going to recapture this in the jar. And this one, because it is all very chunky, this will give us a good example of the difference between a chunky and the detailed. So here is our sentiment in silver. You can read it all nicely. Here's our sentiment, even though it's in dark, so it should show up better. You can see that a lot of the letters, little chunks of the letters are missing. Like this, wow, it's hard to even read. If you can't. So the Y kind of bleeds into the O. Part of the O is missing. The U, the letter U, the top of the two little legs of the U are melted together. Like it's really a mess. Doesn't mean it's a bad powder. This is just not the application for it. So when you're doing something that is very fine detailed, like lettering, you really want a fine powder. But I will show you what this one is great for, because I love these mixed media chunky powders. Sometimes the chunkier the better. So here's a project where I would definitely reach for an embossing powder that is a chunkier or mixed media, which just means it's got a few different mediums inside there. It can have some glitter mixed in with your embossing powder, but it's generally a chunkier one. So this is that same dark chunky one that I used in the last sentiment there. It's got a little bit of gold in there, so it makes it kind of interesting. And I'm going to put it onto the piece of chipboard just to show you how beautiful that is. Now I can use the same ink pad that I used before, or I find it actually nicer to work with a dauber when you're working on something that's not a stamp, but this does work. So I stamped that all over there, and it's clear, so you don't really see it, but it does look kind of like it's wet. Then I'm going to pour this on there nice and generously. Dump off the excess, because any excess is just going to blow away anyway, so you might as well put it back in your jar, save the mess. And I do like to put my lids on because once you get that heat gun going, I don't want to be heating up my whole jar. So here, let's heat that up. Now this is going to be hot for a bit here, but I want to show you that a little bit closer up. Absolutely gorgeous. Love it. But compared to what it's like for letters, so in a large area, like a piece of chipboard, absolutely beautiful. Love that effect. But for something where you need fine detail, it doesn't work at all. The other thing you can do, not just chipboards, but if on your card you want to put the edge of it with some nice embossing powder like that, I sometimes just take my embossing pad, and if you want a nice straight line, just do this on the edge. If you want it a little bit going in on the edge of your card, then instead of having it, what would this be, vertical, start tipping it at an angle. So if I go at an angle here, you can see I'm going to get more of it on there. It's not an exact, like it's not going to be a symmetrical border. It's just putting some of this along that edge. And then when I pour my embossing powder on there, you can see how that makes an edge that is not symmetrical. It's not perfect because of the way I changed the angle of my ink pad. But where's my heat gun here? So I'm holding my heat gun underneath so that none of the wind is blowing that powder away. It does take a little bit longer to heat because the heat's got to go through the paper, and you do have more opportunity to burn your paper. So just keep that heat gun moving, and once you see it melted, you can stop heating. But that gives you a really interesting edge. So there's a few different ways that you can use good chunky mixed media embossing powders. But when you're going for some very fine details where it needs to be very clear, readable, legible, I guess is the word, then you definitely want to look for a powder that says detailed, instead of something that says that it's chunky or mixed media. And you can also tell from looking into the jar, it's a very, very fine powder versus something that's got some big chunks in it. So I hope that takes a little bit of the mystery out of what type of embossing powders that you may want to use for your projects. Stay tuned to this channel for more tips on embossing. We can still talk about embossing inks and many other ideas for embossing. Happy crafting! Thanks for watching.